Final guest this evening is a Chicago-born and raised writer and editor who focuses on pop culture, music, and technology. She's been published in New City, The Sun-Times, Time Out Chicago, Bitch Magazine, Paste Magazine, and tons of publications that don't exist anymore. A blogger since 1999, go old school. She is a co-founder and managing editor of The Learned Fangirl, a blog about pop culture and technology, and is also an editor at JSTOR Daily. She occasionally plays bass guitar with her band Soul Heiress for beer and lulls. Please welcome Keidra Chaney. Good height?
Yeah.
A little lower?
I think this is good.
Okay.
I'm more concerned about the thanks everybody. I am going to apologize ahead of time because I've got one working eye essentially. I've got a weird eye problem and like it's flaring up today. So, which I was gonna write about, but then I decided not to. I'm gonna read something from what will probably eventually be a book about my weird Chicago family. And yeah, anyway, it has no title. For a lot of people, the markers of adulthood are clear and universal. Marriage, your first home, having kids. Lacking all of those things, the gateway to true adulthood for me was symbolized by me making my own gumbo for the first time. Preparing gumbo without the input or guiding hand of my mother or grandmother was for me a sure sign of adult autonomy than any old mortgage could be. It was also way more affordable considering my financially crippling level of student loan debt. Gumbo is not an heirloom recipe for my southern-born family. My grandmother lived with my mom, dad, sister, and me. It was the cook of our family, but the recipe definitely wasn't hers, nor was it her mother's. It's a dish that somehow elbowed its way into our family tradition, like Star Trek fandom and breaking into multi-part harmony sing-alongs. Nonetheless, the preparation of gumbo appears to be a valued family secret. I wasn't consciously aware of this until I volunteered myself to make gumbo for a small Mardi Gras brunch I was throwing at my apartment. I asked my mom for her gumbo recipe. It's a lot of work, she told me over the phone. Most of the recipes in my head, and I'm not saying you can't do it, but I'm just saying it's a lot of work. You have to make the roux from scratch. It's a lot of work, a lot. This was back in December. She pretty much repeated the same speech every time I asked up to the weekend of my brunch, every time revealing some new recipe ingredient or piece of instruction. Don't even bother to make it if you're not going to put okra in it. More flour than oil for the roux. Are you sure you're patient enough to stand there stirring the roux for 45 minutes? The roux is the most important part. My mom's response was unusually passive-aggressive for her, but not totally surprising. We're not so good with the concept of passing along formal tradition on my family's maternal side. And though the Wattswomen all love to eat, we're also weird about cooking. I have become the cook of the family in the many years since my grandmother's death, but cooking came relatively late to me, despite spending so much time at her side in the kitchen. My journey into a late-blooming cook emerged in my early 30s, when I finally had a decent enough kitchen to experiment with non-microwavable recipes. My motivation was due to my own fading memories of my grandmother's cooking that I wanted to resurrect. Granny was not an emotionally demonstrative woman, nor was she especially musical, like my mother, my sister, and myself. Food was her language, her music, and she was a maestro. She made lavish Sunday dinners of honey-baked ham, pot roast, and thick, lava-like slabs of mac and cheese. This was after spending the entire weekend making at least 2 kinds of cake and 3 or so dozen cookies of different flavors every week for the church bake sale. Her opulent Christmas Day brunches were for family and her closest friends at church, and they were the stuff of foodie dreams. Seriously, this was a good spread. A real fancy Southern meal, complete with fried chicken livers, butter beans, collard and mustard greens with ham hocks, tiny little egg salad sandwiches cut into stars, fluffy dinner rolls made from scratch, and homemade peanut brittle that she would wrap up in tiny square gift boxes for guests. It was an epic event, one that she took weeks to prepare for, and still lingers in my memory more fondly than any present I ever received. I'd love to say that I paid close attention to my grandmother's entertaining skills, or that her talents blossomed in me like some kind of Potter-esque magical ability. But at the time, I was way more interested in watching Jem and the Holograms and learning how to program in BASIC, then learning about the wonders of bacon fat gravy. Truth be told, my grandmother never seemed especially interested in passing on her cooking traditions to me or to anyone in the family. I believed it was because she presumed herself immortal, and honestly, I thought she was too. As the de facto stay-at-home parent in my family, my grandmother made rules about food and cooking. She ruled the kitchen with an iron cooking mitt, so there were only 3 times you could even attempt to exercise some autonomy in her kitchen. Number 1 was by waking up extra early before she woke up. Number 2 was by sneaking into the kitchen extra late after she went to sleep. Number 3 was by coming into the kitchen in the days after she cooked a massive meal and she was too tired to do anything. This last instance, I surmised, was how my mother perfected cooking her gumbo recipe. It's worth noting that my mother, for the most part, removed herself from any claim to my grandmother's kitchen. Growing up, she would sometimes cook me breakfast, which would involve pouring some cornflakes and milk into a bowl and or microwaving some bacon. It's also worth mentioning, as an aside, that my sister has absolutely no interest in foodie rituals. I remember asking her once where green beans came from. Her answer was Del Monte. She is, however, a chocolate chip cookie savant and has an uncanny ability to make delicious chocolate chip cookies, much like my grandma's, from scratch. It is literally the only thing she knows how to cook, and like her mysterious peanut allergy, showed up randomly in her late 20s. Anyway, back to my mom and gumbo. When it came to gumbo, it was my mother, not my grandmother, that reigned supreme, and she annually demonstrated her skills in the days after the Christmas event hosted by my grandmother. Those few days where Granny took a strike from the kitchen. My mother would throw her own party, gathering a small group of her girlfriends sometime between Christmas and New Year's Day. They'd come for an afternoon of gumbo, chitlins made by my grandma, music, and spades. I'm not going to get into chitlins here. That's a whole other essay about the history and culinary appeal of pig guts. And it's irrelevant because the gumbo was the star of the show here. Preparing it was a 2-day affair, and I vaguely remember tagging along as my mother would head to the fresh market on 71st Street for crab claws, shrimp, and sausage. She would wake up at the crack of dawn the next day to prep. My grandmother, normally a tyrant of the kitchen, would elect to sit this day out, preferring to act as an armchair chef on the sidelines, critiquing the roux and complaining about the okra being too slimy as she cleaned the chitlins. Gumbo was never Granny's favorite, but you'd never know it by the number of opinions she would volunteer. As usual, I was too preoccupied to actually pay close attention to my mom as she painstakingly stirred the roux, but I was always aware of how my mother and grandmother interacted with each other. My mother alternated between bickering with Granny and incorporating bits and pieces of her cooking advice. And this is what I mean when I say that my family is weird about cooking, and why I wasn't offended when my mother doled out in piecemeal her gumbo cooking secrets. It seems to be a foregone conclusion that Southern food, is a cornerstone of us children of the Great Migration, that time period in the early to mid 20th century where millions of black citizens came from the South to the North for a better life. My grandmother, Ori Watts, came to Chicago around 1942 from Daphne, Alabama, a town outside of Mobile. She was alone, in her 20s, with a 6th grade education. The rumor in my family is that she came to Chicago after punching a white woman in the face who slapped her and called her a nigger. This is unverified, but I believe it. She developed her own cooking skills for the well-to-do white families on Chicago's North Side for whom she worked as a housekeeper and cook. I know so many of my black friends in Chicago, also legacies of the Great Migration, who have stories of cooking traditions passed from grandparents, parents, aunts, and uncles. But my grandmother never pushed us to learn her cooking secrets, even as her kitchen played center stage in our family life. My grandmother's cooking was a source of sustenance, financially and emotionally. For Granny, cooking was an essential skill that she used to get work, as well as a demonstration of her affection. My mother, on the other hand, was the first in my family to receive both a college education and to go to graduate school. She worked during the day, went to school at night, and it was my grandmother that put dinner on the table every night as she did so. For my mother, cooking was an option, a pastime, a skill that was presented only on special occasions. That's simplifying things, of course, but it's the best way I can describe how cooking is such an important but peripheral part of my life today. As for me, cooking is an activity that I have the freedom to luxuriate over, to fuss about, to write navel-gazing essays about in a way that would probably make Granny chuckle dismissively. I spend most of my workday in front of a computer, and cooking is the rare part of my day where I can indulge in something real and tactile. Southern cooking, in particular, is this wonderful combination of art, emotion, and history that allow me to feel connected to my family and my culture in small, casual ways. All the while, as I prepare gumbo or collards or rice and beans, I remain hyper-aware of how privileged I am that cooking can play such a role in my life. I wonder if my grandmother never thought much about passing on her cooking skills to the rest of us because she was counting on the fact that we would never be required to know. I know that she presumed, that she hoped that our college degrees would be the key to a better life for us, in the way that coming to Chicago was hers. Even so, I wish I had paid more attention during the many hours I spent in my grandmother's kitchen. Now that I long to recreate some of the dishes I grew up with, I realize that I now have no formal template to draw from. My approach to cooking my grandmother's favorites is primarily a combination of fuzzy memory, taste testing, and research. It's a bit like alchemy for me as I try to recreate the tastes that have become so connected to my most cherished memories. I still don't have the exact gumbo recipe that my mother prepared, or any of the recipes that my grandmother made over the years. But it doesn't matter so much to me because I have a different legacy to build when it comes to cooking. Now I am beginning to create my own traditions, opening up my home to host my family by blood and by choice. I communicate my love, my joy, my gratitude, and my friendship through the food that I make. I can see and taste in these dishes the heart of those gatherings that my grandmother and mother held so dear. And I call back to the memories that made such an impact on me decades later. Through these dishes, I can write my family's history and my own. That makes me feel more connected to my family and my heritage than any single recipe could. Thanks.